Okay, so this live stream's going to be about how to interpret the formularies. Recently, that's kind of a really big question in a lot of people's minds because Anglicanism can seem a lot of times to be a very hard thing to define. And a lot of Anglicans have went the route of confessionalism, like a lot of confessional Lutherans in the confessional Lutheran movement, or a lot of Presbyterians in their confessional movement that has been going with like R. Scott Clark and people like that, and they have been very dogmatic about the formularies. And now, as a little bit of a historical introduction, I guess that's been the from 1571 when the articles were accepted by parliament up until I believe the late 19th century. If you were a I think it was up until 1854 with Oxford. In order to be a student at Oxford, you had to assent to the articles. If you were to be the king or queen of England, you had to assent to the articles. If you were to be a minister in the Church of England, you had to assent to the articles and, well, to the wider formularies. So, how does that relate to our context now as American Anglicans, who in some of our provinces we are bound to accept the articles, and in others we are not bound to accept the articles? So, what I'm going to go over here is there's kind of four ways of going about this. So that's how I'm going to structure this. Is I'm going to go through each one of the ways, and then finally leading up to the way in which I interpret it. I lay this out in an article I wrote for the North American Anglican. It's called "A Catholic Anglican Rule of Faith," and I got some pushback from that. Somebody in one of the comments said that I had coy, smirking audacity in one of my footnotes. So that was an interesting thing to read. It was under a pseudonym, though, that the kind man wrote that to me. And I've just been thinking about it a lot over the last year or so since I've been getting more seriously, well, I guess it's been 2 years now, more seriously involved into Anglicanism, coming from a Reformed background. So there's going to be really two major groups. The first group is going to say that the articles are true, and the second group is going to admit that the articles have errors. And there's going to be a big spectrum within those two groups. And there's a subdivision among the first group. So the first group says that the formulas are supposed to be interpreted strictly. And under this group, there's two groups. There's the what I call the Reformational Anglican group, and then the Reformed Anglican group. So the first group is going to admit that the Reformational Anglicans are going to admit that the 39 articles teach the pure and undefiled doctrine of Scripture, but they're also going to say that it goes against the Catholic deposit handed to the Reformers because the Catholic deposit made errors and the articles corrected those errors in the Catholic deposit. And that's in contradiction to the second group, which I'm going to call Reformed Anglicans. Those are going to say that the 39 articles are expressing the Catholic deposit and they're expressing the true and biblical system of doctrine. So there's a complete agreement between what is Catholic and what is biblical and what is expressed in the 39 articles. So those are going to be the ones that you'll see a very dogmatic and strict reading of the articles according to the grammatical historical context in which they were written in the 16th century. And that's become a more popular movement recently is confessional Anglicanism and the just love of the formularies. That's been pretty popular recently. And then there's a second very interesting group, And that isn't really around anymore because of the differing historical situation. Like I was talking about earlier, the articles up until the late 19th century were required for ministers and were required for many other positions across English society. So this group is among the Tractarians, and the way I like to put it is that they treat the 39 articles and the rest of the formularies just like a lawyer would treat a book of law. So it's a very fast and loose kind of way of reading it. They're looking for a way in which to fit preconceived notions of Catholicity into a reading of the articles. They're just trying to find any way in the grammar, in the wording of the articles, in order to prove their point. And that's not to say that they're disingenuous when they're doing this, but it is to say that this is in very stark contrast to the way in which the first group, the strict interpreters of the articles, are going to read them. So it's sort of the idea, if you guys have ever heard of the hermeneutic of continuity, that has to do with the Roman Catholic Church and the way in which they're going to interpret Vatican II. They're going to interpret it in continuity with the previous tradition. This is what this group does, but with the 39 articles and with the medieval church. They're going to interpret the 39 articles in a way in which, for example, the Tridentine Council can be uh, interpreted under it. So there's a few very pet interpretations that this group is going to take. There's the idea of Romish doctrine that's very strong in their way of interpreting it. So, like the Romish doctrine of purgatory is condemned in the articles, but the doctrine of purgatory isn't condemned in the articles. There's actually something to say about that, but that's just an example. And there's also things that are commonly called like in the article on the sacraments, it talks about five commonly called sacraments. They're going to say, well, that's just the way in which the common Roman medieval church referred to it, but in the specific way in which the schools talked about it and the divines talked about it, it's fine. That's just condemning the common way in which it was accepted. So again, the specific context for this isn't really around anymore because people don't need to be like this. There's not really any groups which are going to strictly hold people to an acceptance of the 39 articles. So there's no need to be tricky about it. So they're not, well, not that they were being tricky about it. But yeah, and then there's also an important thing to remember about this group is there's going to be a moderate way of interpreting the articles and there's going to be an extreme way of interpreting the articles. It's a spectrum in which this group is going to take. You're going to have guys like E.B. Pusey and Bishop Alexander Forbes and a few of the other Tractarians that stayed within the Anglican Church. They're going to interpret the articles very moderately, and then you'll have the guys like John Henry Newman. This guy is part of the extreme Roman school, I mean, the extreme way of interpreting the articles this way, where it's basically the Tridentine Council and the 39 articles are, you're able to reconcile the two, which I don't believe you can, but that's the way Newman went about it. I doubt the original writer of the 39 articles had other views of purgatory in mind, but I might be wrong. You would have a picture. Yeah, so with purgatory, there's multiple ways in which you can talk about purgatory. I actually have a video that's coming out tomorrow about it, but I guess I can talk about this a little bit. So with the Romish doctrine of purgatory, it's going to be penal. It's going to be penitential. It's going to be for the satisfaction of the temporal consequences of sins, and it's going to be material fire. But there actually are some pre-Tractarian authors that will say that there is a fine view of purgatory, or commonly called purgation, that we could accept as the finalization of our sanctification. So there is actually an okay way of speaking of purgatory that would be in line with the sense of the articles, even in the strict sense. Okay. So the famous example of this is going to be track 90. I'm going to read out a little bit of track 90 so you can kind of get the flavor of how this interpretation usually goes. So this is on Article 2020, so the Romish doctrine concerning purgatory. So now the first remark that occurs on perusing this article is that the doctrine objected to is the Romish doctrine. For instance, no one would suppose that the Calvinistic doctrine containing purgatory, pardons, and image worship is spoken against. Not every doctrine on these matters is a fond thing, but the Romish doctrine. Accordingly, the primitive doctrine is not condemned in it, unless indeed the primitive doctrine be the Romish, which must not be supposed. Now, there was a primitive doctrine on all these points. How far Catholic or universal is a further question, but still so widely received and so respectively supported that it may well be entertained as a matter of opinion by a theologian now. This, then, whatever be its merits, is not condemned by this article. So, with John Henry Newman, his famous in Track 90. If you haven't read Track 90, it's actually a pretty significant piece in understanding the conversion of Newman and the way in which a few of the Tractarians went. Is he's going to say that there's a primitive doctrine of purgatory, and then on one hand, and then on the other hand, there's a Romish doctrine of purgatory. In the articles, you can have the primitive doctrine of purgatory, but you can't have the Romish doctrine of purgatory. And it's going to be that mode of interpretation, which is going to be throughout the entire uh, track 90. And now this wouldn't actually be that much of a problem, except for the fact that he said that the authors of the 39 articles misunderstood in many cases what the Romish doctrine was, at least the official Romish doctrine, and that the Tridentine doctrine in many ways was one with the primitive doctrine. So there's the Romish, then there's the Tridentine, and then there's the primitive. And in a lot of cases, the Tridentine and the primitive is one, and then the Romish is the common errors which are accepted within among the people in the Romish Church. So that becomes a pretty big problem when you have Newman trying to bring together Trent and the articles. But it wouldn't be as much of a problem if he was saying that Trent and the primitive doctrine disagreed, but he's saying that actually they're agreeing, so you can make the two one, which isn't a good idea. As much as I love Newman. So then there's in the second class. So we went over the first, which is going to be the strict way of interpreting it. The second way is going to be the Tractarian, the way in which a lot of the Tractarians interpreted it in their context, which doesn't really exist anymore, but it is useful in some senses. And then you're going to have the second group, which are going to admit the second class, I should say, that are going to admit that the 39 articles have erred. And there's two groups also in. So the first one is the don't care approach. That's it. So this group is going to say that the formularies actually don't really matter, that the formularies are only of historical value. It's interesting to see what Anglicanism believed in the 16th century, but we don't really have to care about the doctrine of the formularies. And this actually comes in two types, which is very, very interesting. So after the context of the 19th century, where there was subscription, which was forced, there was a period in which subscription was not forced, which we exist into now. So there's going to be certain Anglo-Catholics who are going to say that the 39 articles don't really matter, and they can just accept what what's the teaching of the larger Catholic Church in the East and in the West. And then there's going to be a second group, which is it's very fascinating. It's almost the polar opposite of the Anglo-Catholics. The evangelicals have the same way of reading the articles. And when I thought of that, I it kind of blew my mind because I'd never thought about it that way before. Is the Anglo-Catholics and the hyper evangelicals and the way in which they read the articles, they both read them in the same way, because the evangelicals are going to say it's just a historical document of how Anglicanism once was. Uh, the Bible teaches this, and the Bible has more authority, or at least their personal interpretation of the Bible has more authority than the articles. Therefore, I can just throw them away, and however I'm feeling today, that is what my doctrine is going to be. And I actually had a discussion with a with Reformed Catholics read them accurate. I'm getting to that, Sando. I'm getting to that. There's one last group, but I talked to an evangelical Anglican one time, an evangelical Anglican priest who's retired, and we got into a little bit of a discussion about election and predestination. And I actually referenced him back to the articles because this was in the ACNA. So, in the ACNA, you by the Jerusalem Declaration, you have to subscribe to the articles if you're going to be a priest. So, talking to him, he basically said, like, "Yeah, I know the articles say that, but I don't really care. That's just a historical document." And that it made it click in my mind that that's the exact way in which Anglo-Catholic, hyper Anglo-Catholics are going to read the 39 articles. They're not really going to care about what the 39 articles are going to say about anything. Is if it's against the Western Catholic view, or if it's against my personal interpretation of the Bible, it doesn't matter because it's just a historical document. We're not really bound by them anymore. It doesn't really matter. We don't really care. It's just very fascinating. Okay, but enough on that. Finally, we're gonna get to the right way, or at least my approach to reading the formularies. But this is more descriptive than argumentative, actually. So this is what I'm going to call the Catholic Anglican approach. This is what I laid out in the North American Anglican article. So if you want a this more fleshed out, I guess I could put that in the description when I post this. So this is on the premise that we're part of a duplex ecclesiae. So we're part of a dual church, that as Anglicans in our baptisms, that we are both Catholics and part of the English church. So we're both part of a universal church and a local church. And the universal church and the local church has two sets of dogmatic declarations. So with the universal church, they have the Catholic creeds, they have the ecumenical councils, they have things like that, which make certain dogmatic statements about what the Catholic Church agrees, what it means to be a Catholic, and what you have to accept as a Catholic. And then the Anglican Church, it has the same thing, but binding on the local English Catholic Church. And that is going to be in the form of the formularies. So the formularies bind us to a certain set of doctrines in the 39 articles, and I guess the homilies and the ordinal and the Book of Common Prayer liturgy. And the Church Catholic binds us to a different set of doctrines in the ecumenical councils and in the creeds. So now how do these two relate? So my premise in navigating this issue is that the Catholic has more interpretation than the local. That ought to be always true. The Catholic containing the sensus fidelium of the Church Catholic, in council with the patriarchs and the bishops of the world, making a solemn declaration on a certain issue, has more authority than the bishops of a certain church making a certain declaration. For example, if you go back in time to, let's say, the Council of Orange, and then you compare that to the Council of Ephesus. The Council of Orange, while important as a local council, is not binding and never has been binding on the entire church. But you better believe that the Council of Ephesus and the Declaration of Theotokos is going to be binding on the entire church. So, in this relationship between the formularies and the Catholic deposit, there are four different situations that we could occur. So, the first situation is that they agree. So, on issues like the Trinity or the Incarnation, where both of them are going to say the same exact things in express words. So, we have no problem there. We can affirm what the Church Catholic says, and we can affirm what the Anglican Church says. Now, a second situation is the Church Catholic speaks, but the Anglican Church does not. So we have to affirm the Catholic, such as monothelitism. In the formularies, the Anglican Church never makes a dogmatic statement the about whether Christ has one or two wills, but the Church Catholic in the Third Council of Constantinople, the Sixth Ecumenical Council, has spoken on this and affirmed dithelitism, that Christ has two wills. So we accept the Catholic. Now, in a third situation, the Anglican Church speaks, but the Catholic does not. So we affirm the Anglican. So, in situations and issues such as election, there's never been a dogmatic statement from the Catholic Church about the nature of election, except obviously the condemnation of Pelagius. Um, and another issue is going to be transubstantiation. There's never been a ecumenical council on the issue of the Eucharistic presence. So in these situations, we're going to accept the Anglican formularies as authoritative because the Catholic Church hasn't spoken. So this is very helpful actually in many different ways, because you have a lot of these doctrines where the Catholic Church doesn't give us guidance and doesn't speak. And you also have the Anglican Church speaking on these issues. So you can fill in the gaps where it's not dogmatically binding to the entire church, but it's only dogmatically binding to our local church, where it doesn't come to the weight of certainty. Like, I wouldn't be so certain on the nature of election or the nature of the Eucharistic presence to bind the whole church, but our local church has found it prudent to bind the Anglican communion on this. And now the fourth situation is where we're going to get into a lot of trouble. The fourth situation is that they both speak in contradiction to one another. And in this situation, we accept the Catholic and reject the Anglican. So a certain situation where this is going to happen is going to be on images. So the 39 articles and the homilies, especially in the homily on the peril of idolatry, I think that's what it's called, and versus the Second Council of Nicaea, they disagree on the issue of images. So in this situation, what do we do? Do we accept the Anglican, or do we accept the local, or do we accept the Catholic teaching on this matter? And I would argue in this framework where the Catholic has more authority than the local, because the local is derived from the Catholic, that the Catholic is going to have supreme authority over the local where there are disagreements. But honestly, these disagreements are very few in number, and they are very minor issues. If you think about it, there are many, many more issues that are spoken of in the formularies which either agree with the Church Catholic, or um, in which the Church Catholic doesn't speak. So we are licitly able to accept what the Anglican Church teaches on this matter. So this shouldn't be too big of a problem for the strict interpreters of the articles, who say that you can't disagree with the articles at all. But this should be a more satisfying approach for those who want to retain Catholicity. So that's all I have to say. Are there any questions in the chat? Let me see. What is Sandos saying about the Talmud up there? I don't see any questions. So I think that's all, boys. Remember, like always, to subscribe, to like this video, to share it, and become a patron if you're not a patron yet. Oh, thank you, Jonah. You're very kind. Okay, I'll have a spaces tomorrow night on Twitter. So if anybody wants to hop on that, I guess we can talk about this too. So I will see you all later. You can ask me questions on Twitter if you want, because I'll be on later. Bye bye.